Fellas, this week is UFC Fight Night, Vettori versus Dolidze 2, and I'm going to run through the whole card and give you guys my picks and predictions. Not a very good card this week, so don't worry, this is going to be a short one, and let's just jump straight into it. And the first fight of the night, starting off the prelims, is Yuneisy Duben versus Carli Judice. Now, Yuneisy Duben on the Contender Series had a really nice overhand knockout and showed some power that I haven't really seen from many women fighters. Yeah, she looks like a bit of a threat. Not much to go on. She hasn't really seen much of a submission or grappling game. Carli Judice, she's lost her past two fights. She lost on the Contender Series and then lost her first bout in the UFC to Gabriela Fernandez. They were really good fights, but man, nothing promising. She does have a decent chin on her. She didn't really get wobbled or knocked by anything huge, but I just think Duben's power is going to be too much. I think Yuneisy Duben's going to win this by round 2 KO. Next up on the prelims, we have Evan Elder versus Marquel Mederos. Evan Elder, he had a really good win over Darius Flowers recently. I think that was his last fight, and he won that via a submission win. He showed some really good grappling in that fight and sort of dominated on the ground, but he also showed decent striking and really mixed up his shot selection, which I think is an advantage in sort of the earlier stages of your UFC career, targeting the body, tiring people down. Marquel Mederos, he had a really fun fight against London Quinones. That was a good one, but he only really showed striking. He out-volumed Quinones, but he did get taken down at certain points and controlled, and I could 100% see Evan Elder's doing that in this fight. So I think that Evan Elder is going to get this one done, and I think it's going to be by round 3 submission. Moving on, we have Josiane Nunes versus Priscila Cachoeira. Nunes, she's on a 2-fight losing streak. She lost to Cavalcanti, which I don't think is a horrible loss, because I think Cavalcanti's sort of the next up in that division. Chelsea Chandler, a bit worse of a decision loss, but overall she's a pretty good striker with decent power, and grappling, she's alright, nothing crazy. Cachoeira, she's been around for a while now. Her first fight was in 2018 fighting Shevchenko, and she's sort of a 50-50 fighter. She'll win 1 and then lose 2. Lost to Judice, kind of gets dominated on the ground, but I don't think that's a threat with Nunes. But also on the feet, I think she'll also sort of get dominated in this fight. So I have it going to Nunes by a decision. And next up is Daniel Barez versus Andre Lima. So Daniel Barez had a really fun fight with Altamirano at UFC Paris, and he showed some really good striking in that fight. He hit Altamirano with some shots that really wobbled him and threw him off balance and sort of forced him to back up, and he'll target different parts of the body as well, which is really nice to see. Andre Lima, very active fighter. He's fought 3 times in 2024 and he won all 3 of those fights. Granted that the Igor Severino fight got sort of called off because he got bit. Severino bit Lima. To be fair, that was while he was attempting sort of a guillotine up against the fence, so I saw him winning regardless of the bite happening or not. Outside of that, he is on a really good winning streak. He's a really good striker, but also he's not afraid to go to the ground. He'll dominate you on the ground as well, and I think he's just overall just better, and he'll rack up points throughout this fight that will make him win by decision. Moving on, next in the card, we have Carlos Vera versus Josias Musasa. Now, Carlos Vera, he showed a lot of submitting potential in Fury FC on that regional scene. He submitted most of his opponents in sort of the first couple of rounds. He moved to the UFC, and we started to see him start to go to decisions a bit more. He went to decision with Nakamura, lost that one. Went to another decision with Brad Katona, lost that one. And I think Brad Katona is sort of a good weather vane for whether sort of these new up-and-comers should start entering the sort of top 20 area. Josias Musasa, he has a ridiculous record on the regional scene, with most of his sort of wins coming from these knockouts, and most of those wins being first-round knockouts for that. His name's literally the KO Wizard, so that sort of speaks to sort of how much of a knockout threat he is. He did actually go to a split decision on the Contender Series, which is a little bit concerning, but I don't know, some people have their off nights on the Contender Series, so I'm not going to put too much sort of weight on that. And outside of that, I just think he presents too much of a striking threat for Carlos Vera, and I'm going to be a bit risky. I think Josias Musasa is going to win with a round 1 knockout. Next up, we have Diyar Nurgozhay versus Brendson Ribeiro. Diyar Nurgozhay had a really good Contender Series performance. He sort of showed one-way traffic when it came to the striking and just teed off on his opponent, mixing up shots to sort of different parts of the body as well, which I really like to see. He showed good power, and he finished it off with a head kick KO. That was pretty impressive. Brendson Ribeiro, he's on a 2-fight losing streak currently, with his most recent loss being a really close decision with Caio Machado. Besides that, he's been knocked out by Mingyang Zhang, but who hasn't at this rate? And one problem I see in his game is definitely his sort of tendency to go to decisions while not really racking up volume strikes. He will often target the head, try and go for an early finish, but when it comes to the decisions, he will usually lose on not throwing enough. So for that reason, I think Diyar Nurgozhay is just going to sort of outstrike him to a decision. I don't think he's going to get a KO like he did on the Contender Series, but I do think it will be sort of an outstrike competition, which Diyar Nurgozhay would probably win. Next up, we have Stephanie Luciano versus Sam Hughes. Stephanie Luciano had a really good fight against Talita Alencar on the Contender Series, where they both sort of stood and struck with each other. That one ended in a draw, but they ran it back within the UFC as her sort of first fight, and this one she dominated. She sort of, all 3 rounds, outstruck her. If it went to the ground, she'd mix in some ground and pound and also outstrike her in that part. And yeah, overall, I think she won all 3 rounds, or if she didn't, it sure looked like it. She's a really technical striker that's not afraid to go to the ground. Sam Hughes won over Dudakova recently. I thought that was a bit close. I think it could have definitely gone both ways, but Dudakova showed sort of more damage and got outstruck on the feet. Dudakova mixed in some wrestling, which I think made it close, but yeah, that one was a win for Sam Hughes. Before that, she lost to Yasmin Jauregui, which I think sort of shows that against any decent striker, she most likely will get outstruck and lose by a decision. And for that reason, I think Stephanie Luciano will outstrike Sam Hughes and take home a decision win. And closing out the prelims is Waldo Cortes Acosta versus Ryan Spann. So Waldo Cortes Acosta, his last 2 wins have sort of been asterisks next to them. So in the case of the Duspain win, it was crazy. No one really expected Duspain to lose. He was sort of the big prospect until he got fraud checked by Acosta. But sort of people realized shortly afterwards that after the first round, Duspain isn't a threat. In fact, after the first minute, Duspain isn't really that much of a threat. I think he's improving that, but yeah, that was kind of a weird win. And then he won over Arlovsky, and that was another sort of thing, whereas Arlovsky was on his way out. He retired shortly after that, so people were saying, oh, it's sort of like a out of his prime Arlovsky. He's sort of on his way out. So yeah, those 2 wins, kind of dodgier wins, and I don't think he really showed any dominance in either of those performances. He sort of isn't really proficient in one area. He just sort of is well-rounded in both, and when it comes to winning fights, he'll often just sit on top of his opponent and sort of get those points. Ryan Spann, he's moving up to heavyweight for this fight, which I don't really like. He's never really been known to be sort of a knockout fighter, so he doesn't really need that increase in weight that sort of equals an increase in punch power. In fact, he's better at grappling, I think, and sort of submissions, which I don't think improves greatly when moving up in weight. Granted, he had a really good win over Oven St. Preux recently, submitting him in the first round, which sort of made me think he's back from that sort of slump he had. And overall, I think the grappling threat will sort of prevent Acosta from sort of shooting on him and trying to take him to the ground. And on the feet, I think he'll just out-volume Acosta. I can't really see him being put out. So yeah, I think Ryan Spann will win this one by a decision. And starting off the main card, we have Suyoung You versus AJ Cunningham. Suyoung You, he had a very dominant performance on UFC Macau, where he sort of outstruck and outgrappled his opponent to a decision win. He doesn't have much experience in the UFC, which is kind of concerning, but so far what I've seen, I think he's a pretty promising prospect, and I think he showed a very dominant performance that night. Moving on to AJ Cunningham, I have a bit of an issue with his fight style. He lost to Ludovic Klein, and while losing to Ludovic Klein in itself isn't a horrible loss, because I think Ludovic Klein's one of the better prospects out there, he lost in a fashion where he just got dominated the whole fight, got put up against a cage, and then just the pressure and pace made him fold. He got finished within the first round. Similar to his Contender Series loss, he has this issue where if you just sort of put on this fast pace and this high pressure on him, he'll lose composure, kind of fold and wilt, and then that gives you the opportunity to put him away. And I think that will definitely happen in this fight. My prediction for this one is Suyoung You by a round 3 knockout. Moving on to the second fight on the main card, we have Damon Blackshear versus Cody Gibson. So Damon Blackshear, he has some very promising striking, and then if he gets taken to the ground, he won't dominate on the ground, but he does show decent ground game. He actually does have a submission win over Jose Johnson, but sort of his lanky 6-foot frame makes it sort of easy for Johnson to get taken down, so I don't really rate that as much, and I don't think that speaks to his grappling ability. But overall, I don't think he has that knockout power, so the fight will likely go to a decision. Cody Gibson doesn't have knockout power either though, so that's good, but he also does possess sort of a submission threat shown in that Kelleher fight. But most likely it will go to the cards for this one, and I think in that case he'll get outscored. Gibson often has this habit of sort of losing the fight by getting outscored. In the case of the Miles Johns fight, the Brad Katona fight, or some others. But yeah, he has a bad habit of letting it go to the cards and letting himself sort of get outperformed. And I think he does possess worse striking than Damon Blackshear, which would make the decision most likely go to him. So that's my pick for this fight. I think Damon Blackshear will take this one home by a decision win. Moving on, we have Alexander Hernandez versus Kurt Holliber. Alexander Hernandez has been in this game for a while now. He's fought some of the biggest names in the sport. Early in his career, he fought Moicano, he fought Dober, he fought Cerrone. He lost all three of these, but he actually beat Dariush early in his career, which shows somewhat of like potential to make it sort of big. Recently he's been losing fights so that he should be winning. He lost to Damon Jackson, which I didn't think would happen, but here we are. One thing that makes him good is his experience. You know, he knows not just to target the head, he'll target the legs, he'll target the body, he'll wear an opponent down and maybe try and find a finish in the third, but he's also comfortable to sort of take it to the cards. Kurt Holliber, decent at striking, but most likely will get outstruck by anyone possessing sort of a monicum of striking efficiency. He got beat by Trey Ogden, he got beat by Thiago Moises, and overall he's just 2-7 in the UFC. That's not a very good record, not very promising. I don't like that. And I think he's the worst striker out of the two, so overall I think that's going to go to the cards, and I think Alexander Hernandez is just going to outscore and win by a decision. Moving on, we have Suyoung Choi versus Kevin Vallejos. Suyoung Choi, he hasn't been doing great recently. He recently got finished by both Steve Garcia and Michael Triazano. Man, he's been on a skid. He's been around in the game forever now, and he hasn't really shown much potential since his Julian Erosa fight from 2021, and hasn't like really finished a fight since. Kevin Vallejos, he lost to Gene Silva in his first appearance on the Contender Series, but that fight went to a decision, which is crazy. No one really has ever done that since with Gene Silva, and you know, we've seen with age, Gene Silva is sort of a top dog when it comes to the featherweights. To date, that's his only loss in his career, and he came back later, back on the Contender Series, and he beat the snot out of his opponent in the second time. That fight was a one-way showing, and he sort of beat him until he dropped and then finished him. Overall, I think the striking is just a lot better by Kevin Vallejos, and I think if you put him up against a guy with such a weak chin as Suyoung Choi, I think it's going to end by a KO. So I think Kevin Vallejos is too much of a prospect, a good promising one, to sort of get finished or lose here. So I have it Kevin Vallejos by a round 1 KO. And now we're on the co-main event, Chidi Nurgozhay versus Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos. What a mouthful. Nurgozhay had some great wins recently, especially he had a really good win over Jared Gooden that went to the decision. He's been put away a few times, which is a bit worrying, by Robocop and Olasejchik, but more likely than not he'll sort of get out-volumed if he does lose. And I'm a bit worried because he hasn't shown much knockout potential since his debut in 2022. Moving on to Zaleski dos Santos, he's a warrior. He always pushes the pace, he'll always be on that front foot, never really backing up, and he'll often try and find finishes wherever he can. He's recently moved up from lightweight to welterweight, well, not so recently, but he's moved up from lightweight to welterweight, and besides the Randy Brown loss, I think this has been mostly beneficial for him. He has a lot more sort of finishing potential because the power of his punches has like increased significantly since, and he hasn't really lost much when it comes to sort of his ground game. And I think overall he sort of will out volume. I think the power punches will be a real threat to Nurgozhay, and even if he does take it to the ground, I think he'll just sort of dominate there as well. And overall, Nurgozhay sort of getting finished by these Robocops and Olasejchiks. I think Dos Santos has a way higher chance of finishing him, so I'm a bit worried about that. I don't think he will, but I think he will win in a dominant fashion, and I can see this one going to Dos Santos by a decision. And now we arrive at the main event. Marvin Vettori takes on Roman Dolidze for the second time. Marvin Vettori won that first fight. Granted, it was a 3-round bout, so take that into consideration, and it was sort of a more active Marvin Vettori at the time. Marvin Vettori is a good fighter. He's not really sort of known for finishing people. He'll usually just take them into a decision, out-wrestle them, sort of throw some more strikes. And I think his chin is what definitely does that for him. He's never getting finished, so he usually can just sort of outlast his opponents. But I'm very worried about this layoff. It's been 2 years pretty much since his last fought. He last fought in June 2023. He was meant to fight Brendan Allen halfway through last year, but he had to pull out due to another injury, which is also a thing I'm pretty concerned about. But looking back at Vettori, he had some good wins. Beat Paulo Costa, beat Jack Manson, beat Kevin Holland. But I don't know if the Marvin Vettori that's going to come back after 2 years is going to be the same Marvin Vettori that we saw sort of 2 years ago. He is fighting Roman Dolidze. Dolidze definitely better at middleweight. He can fight at light heavyweight. He beat Anthony Smith at light heavyweight, but I think he shows his most dominant performances at middleweight and has sort of more power when compared to the middleweight chins. He had a very dominant performance over Kevin Holland and Jack Manson, both finishing those fights. He lost to Imavov recently, which I think with time we've come to see. The fact that he even went to 5-round decision with Imavov is really impressive. Imavov is a serious danger on the feet. He put out Izzy recently, which I thought wouldn't happen, which is crazy, but yeah, so I think Dolidze's definitely improved just over time, and he is sort of a threat at the middleweight division. I don't think he's going to finish Vettori. Vettori has one of the best chins in the UFC, and it's one of his advantages to sort of winning fights. No one can really put him out, so he's just going to keep pushing the pace on you until you sort of lose by a decision. But I think with so much time out of the cage, with so many injuries piling up and just his inactivity, I don't think he's going to be able to push this pace for 5 whole rounds. So I actually think Dolidze is going to take this one. I think it's going to be a decision, of course, and yeah. And that is it, guys. Those are my predictions for UFC Fight Night, Vettori vs Dolidze 2. This card, I'm going to be honest, isn't a great card, so it was kind of a struggle to sort of pick some of these earlier fights. And yeah, on screen now, my predictions, Cam predictions, you know the drill. And yeah, thank you for watching. See you guys. Bye.